Welcome to today's webinar, Connecting Your Strategic Roadmap to the Backlog. My name is Andre Toys, and I will be your moderator today. Before we jump in, I would like to ask everybody to tell us who you are and fill out this short poll. So please select if you are in product management, or you work in marketing, or engineering and development, or you're the founder or part of an executive team, or if you work in another department. Looks like a lot of votes are coming in. Thanks everyone for filling this out. Let me close the poll and share the results. Awesome. Looks like the majority is in product management. We have 72 today on the line that are PMs, followed by engineering and development. Not surprising, we are going to share in particular how those two groups can work better together. So we have a lot of exciting content for you guys. So let me announce who is going to speak today. First, we have Mike from Atlassian. Mike is the Director of Business Development at Atlassian. And he works with Atlassian partners to bring new integrations to the Atlassian marketplace. Mike is a technology veteran and has been working in software for nearly 2 decades. And Mike will be sharing lots of recommendations how to effectively manage your product backlog. Welcome, Mike.
Hey guys, it's great to be here.
And our second speaker for today will be Jim. Jim is the co-founder and chief strategist here at ProductPlan. For over 15 years, he has helped launch new products now generating hundreds of millions in revenue. He was part of the founding team at Appfolio, a vertical SaaS company. And prior to Appfolio, Jim validated and helped launch GoToMyPC and GoToMeeting, both companies acquired by Citrix. Jim is a frequent speaker on product management and the process of discovering successful business models. Welcome, Jim.
Great to be here. Thanks, Andre.
So a common challenge for product managers is the communication and prioritization of product initiatives. And it can be tempting to have the backlog guide your product decisions. I'm sure when you read this question, a few of you can relate to this. And when you signed up for today's webinar, we asked all of you to submit questions that you would like to get covered in today's webinar. We got well over 200 questions. So thank you so much for submitting all those questions. We read all of them and we tried our best to address a fair amount of those common patterns that we saw in today's content. So hopefully you will find today's content helpful for you. A few of the different questions that were submitted, and those are all questions from you guys that I highlighted here, that were the common patterns that we saw. The first one is just general differences between the roadmap and backlog. And then how to get the technical team excited about the roadmap. Another common theme that we saw is how to best incorporate market needs in your roadmap. And then there were a lot of questions around prioritization. And I know that in particular, Jim later will talk about a few specific techniques. And then last but not least, how to best maintain the roadmap and the backlog over time. And Mike has a lot of tips and tricks for you here. So today's agenda is first, we are going to show key differences between your backlog and your product roadmap. Then Jim will do a live demonstration how this actually could look like in reality. Then Mike will share some best practices on the backlog. And then Jim will wrap it up with roadmap best practices. And then my favorite part of a live webinar is the live Q&A. Quick reminder to please use the panel in GoToWebinar to submit your questions. We will look through all of them and then we will address a few of those at the end of the webinar. We set aside about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar, so please take advantage that you attend this live webinar and submit many questions. But without further ado, I want to hand it over to Jim, who will talk about the key differences between your backlog and your product roadmap.
Great. Thanks so much, Andre. So let's talk a little bit about some of those key differences. And as Andre mentioned at the very beginning, there are often people who believe that the backlog is the roadmap. So I first want to dispel that the backlog itself is very tactical, and the roadmap is more of a strategic way of looking at what you'll be building. So as part of this way of stepping back, let's first talk a little bit about how we see the big product vision that you have for your product working its way to very specific release plans in your backlog. So we see the product vision of your product as something that is unchanging, and it can often last over a number of years, and your product may not yet be fulfilling that vision. So for those of you working for startups, oftentimes the vision is very clear. Sometimes as your company grows, that vision may not be as clear. And so I do encourage product managers to make sure that the team understands where you're headed over the long term with that product vision. Then that in turn gives you your product goals. And the goals can be over a period of months or perhaps even years. Now, we often see product goals being developed over a 1 to 2 year horizon. And these product goals are customer-related goals that you might have, or they might be business-related goals. And we could talk a little bit more about that, and I have some examples for you later on about what those goals could be. But typically in product organizations, we see a handful of goals being developed over the short to maybe 2 year time horizon. And then the product team works to fulfill and meet those goals. And then from those goals, you're developing your product roadmap. And the product roadmap is, we think about it as a strategic document. So it's not really the document that you use to develop from. Rather, it's a communication vehicle. It's a way of talking about where you're headed and why. And then from that roadmap, you're developing your release plan and backlog. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of how we're viewing the roadmap and the backlog. And we're going to talk quite a bit about how you need to tie these together to be able to communicate not just the details, but also the strategy behind what you're developing. All right, so as I mentioned, it's the big picture versus the details. And this example here is a very typical product roadmap that you might see. It's often based in time. And in this example here, it's based on months and quarters. And then you can see how it's broken out by swim lanes. And then that in turn is tied to this tactical backlog. And you can see this backlog in Jira here. And so we're going to talk more about that, and I'll have a demo for you as well about how this can be tied together. All right, so just to recap, the product roadmap, big picture, communication focus. It often has a longer term horizon. It has really rough dates, months, quarters, or sometimes even no dates, because you don't want to be overpromising what you'll be delivering, especially because in an agile environment, that prioritization and the roadmap is constantly changing. And so as a result, you're planning things that are fuzzier, and you're not going to have very specific development estimates. They might be big picture estimates, t-shirt sizes, for example. And so you're going to be using communication tools like PowerPoint or products like ProductPlan in order to communicate that long-term strategy. And with that.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And then just to talk a little bit about the backlog. So really first at a high level, right? The backlog is that list of outstanding user stories, it's bugs and features for a product or your sprint. And it's a very powerful, very tactical tool. And the one thing that's very important is to have one single source of truth, right? For your stories, bugs, and features. I think a trap that a lot of startups fall into is that they tend to have multiple tools going on to try and do multiple different things, and that is just a clear recipe for disaster. The backlog is very much focused on execution and the current jobs to be done and the tasks at hand. Very much detail-oriented and shorter term. So in a Scrum, obviously with dates or perhaps no dates. So all very key, very granular things where you're getting things done, and with those granular estimates. And then, of course, obviously there are a lot of tools out there. We, of course, are a little bit partial to Jira. I myself, I come to Atlassian from a startup that was frankly having a lot of backlog challenges. Our backlog was becoming our roadmap. Our backlog was unyieldy and unmanageable. And we were frankly using a variety of tools from spreadsheets to Asana to other free tools, because that's always a big deal when you're a startup, unfortunately, and which were really just nothing more than other kind of glorified spreadsheets, if you will. But our move to Jira had very clear impact on happier developers, happier product managers. For me, in a business development capacity, what was most important was just happier customers as well, as we were being more efficient and more clear as we worked through our backlog. People weren't doing redundant tasks, and just a lot of clear benefits from having a well-honed backlog that was groomed tightly. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those best practices later in the presentation.
Thanks, Mike. So now that we shared some conceptual points around the roadmap and around the backlog, let me hand it over to Jim, and he will do a live demonstration how this could look like in real life. Let me make Jim presenter.
Thank you, Andre. And thanks, Mike, for that great overview. So now I'm going to show you a little bit about how you can connect your roadmap with your backlog. To start, a lot of our customers use Confluence in order to communicate what's happening with the product roadmap. In this example here, we have a product team, and then we've embedded a product plan roadmap directly within Confluence. The way that you do this is through a feature that we call private sharing. And once you've generated a private link, you can embed this into Confluence. And the benefit of doing this is that you're able to share the roadmap broadly with a wide audience. And this audience doesn't need licenses of Product Plan in order to view the roadmap. So they can get self-service access to the roadmap. And this roadmap is easy to click into. They can drill in and they can get information about what's happening on the roadmap. So for this example here, they can see what's happening with the API. They can see the effort level. They can even jump out to Jira if they have access in order to see the stories and issues that are contained within this epic. So it's a great way of keeping your stakeholders up to speed with what's happening. So I'm going to jump back to a product plan roadmap. And this is the roadmap that an editor or a product manager might see. And they can easily update their roadmap. So product plan is drag and drop, and you can easily, as priorities change, you can drag and drop these initiatives around and in order to very quickly update the roadmap, and everyone that has this roadmap shared with them will be seeing these updates. They can also subscribe to notifications on the roadmap, which is really a powerful feature for keeping stakeholders engaged with what's happening. So to connect it, you can open up the details for one of these initiatives on the roadmap. So this one is called Application Upgrade. And you can understand the strategic importance and effort level and so on. And then you can connect this to Jira. So I'm going to jump out and I'm going to select a Jira issue. And you can search by issue ID or you can search by name. And I'm going to jump out to this epic. All right, so now I've connected the product plan epic with the Jira epic. All right, and similarly, if once my items are connected, I can very quickly jump out and I can see the issues that are contained with it. So I'm going to put this into view mode. This is actually what your stakeholders will see on the roadmap. And I've already connected this Jira epic called Security 2.0. And we can jump out to this into Jira, and you can see the issues that are contained within this epic. Now, as these issues are completed, the progress within Product Plan is automatically updated. So this is a feature for that saves a lot of time for product managers and helps communicate to the stakeholders about the progress of items on the roadmap. So this is something that you get with the Product Plan Jira integration that you can find in the Atlassian marketplace. And I think at this point, that is what I'd like to demonstrate. Of course, you can link to other items, web pages, and things like that. But I'm going to turn it back to Andre here.
Okay, I hope everybody can see my screen again. Again, apologies for a little hiccup there. So after the demonstration, now you saw how this could look like in real life. And now we would like to share some best practices, starting with best practices, how to maintain and manage your backlog efficiently. And Mike, do you want to take this away?
Yeah, definitely.
You're muted. If you unmute yourself, that would be great.
I'm off mute. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Perfect.
All right, sorry. Yeah, so let's go into backlog best practices, and I think, Andre, we're going to open that up with a poll question, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So that poll question is, I'll just read it for everybody. It's on the screen. What agile methodology do you use in your organization? So the options we've got here are Scrum, Kanban, a combination of different agile methodologies, other, or we're just not agile at all. So we'll give you guys a little bit of time to input your answers in there, and then we'll do a quick review. Andre, how's that looking?
That looks great. Let me share the results.
Great. So obviously here, and Andre and Jim, feel free to comment as well. I mean, Scrum, and this is about what I would have, if I would have had to guesstimate as well, I think I probably would have guessed that the numbers would have came in something like this, with 62% on Scrum, 19 on Kanban, and then of course, that lovely a combination of things. And I think personally what I find encouraging too is that only 9% here are not agile. It's going to be really interesting to probably take this and cross-compare it back to some other results as well. Jim and Andre, I don't know if you guys have any other comments on the slides.
Fairly similar to what we've seen for with our customer base and others.
Yeah, great.
All right, awesome. So let's go on to some backlog best practices. So a few key things to cover here. So one, and this ties back to what Jim spoke about earlier, and I think this is really important, is that symbiotic relationship between the backlog and the roadmap, right? The roadmap is not the backlog is definitely not the roadmap, but the two definitely intertwine and interweave, excuse me. So first thing that's very important to point out is that the initial backlog is derived from the roadmap, right? The team's roadmap and requirements, I mean, they're really the foundation for that product backlog. Roadmap initiatives break down into several epics, and each epic will have several requirements and user stories. And this is all what lives inside of Jira and inside of the backlog, right? And then when your products get out into the wild or you get into testing, then that's when all the excitement starts to happen, when you have tons of customer feedback coming in, right? And it's really important to have the right tools in place, right, to be able to get that feedback into Jira. And of course, Jira Capture is an extremely valuable tool to be able to do that. And then of course, there are a ton of other great tools on the Atlassian marketplace that help you collect user feedback and different testing tools and a variety of great things to bring that feedback back in. Then the next key part here is to groom all of that feedback, right? Because while it's great to get feedback from all your customers, not all feedback is great or happens to be created equal, right? And that's really where backlog grooming comes into play, and that's when the product owner and some or all of the rest of the team reviews the backlog, ensures the backlog contains the appropriate items, that they're properly prioritized, and that the items at the top of the backlog are ready for delivery. So that's really a key part of that. And then the other thing is to continue to properly tier the backlog, right? And we have a diagram here as to how things can kind of come in. They then become unprioritized work, and then they become prioritized where they're in the queue and the development team is working on those items. And of course, if that pile of issues that the dev team is working on gets thinned out, then you can just quickly go back into that unprioritized queue and move those into the prioritized to where the team can start to work on them. And then of course, the next phase here is to leverage the backlog to revisit and refine the product roadmap. And again, this is where everything comes back full circle, right? Your roadmap, it has to be realistic, right? If the roadmap is calling for some amazing new feature to be delivered in the next quarter, but your development team is just drowning in a backlog of critical things that need to be done, then it's time to come back and revisit the roadmap. And maybe something needs to be pushed out or modified accordingly. And those are really the key things that we wanted to talk about there. And then on the next slide, so if on the off chance you haven't seen Jira or had the opportunity to use Jira, we've got 2 shots here, examples of what the Kanban board looks like inside of Jira, and then of course a sample product backlog. And if you haven't had the opportunity to check it out, we really hope you do, and hope you take advantage of this great integration that ProductPlan has put together as well.
Thanks, Mike. Now that you hopefully have some new recommendations and new ways how to go about managing your backlog, Jim is going to give you some recommendations for your roadmap.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andre. And thanks, Mike. I thought that was a really good overview of tips for the backlog. And you'll see that some of my tips here and recommendations for the roadmap dovetail with that. So my first recommendation is, we have a poll, don't we?
Yeah, sorry, Jim. I snuck in another poll.
Yeah,
Let me launch this poll.
Yeah, I'm actually curious. Who drives your product roadmap? So who's the primary person or organization or group that actually dictates and drives what gets on the product roadmap? I'm curious about this one. So we'll take a few seconds here. I think a lot of us would love to say that it's product management, but the truth is that it might be different in different organizations. Oh, look at that. Okay, so product management did win out with the majority, but interesting that executives dictate this as well. I've seen many organizations where the executives will dictate the goals, the strategic goals, and then it's up to product to understand how to deliver on that. And it's continually surprising to me how often sales and marketing is involved in the roadmap process. They're certainly they are a stakeholder, but they should have a say in the roadmap. But it's in many organizations, it's actually driven by sales and marketing, which is always fascinating to me. Okay, good. So let's talk a little bit about some tips and some recommendations for you about the roadmap. So to recap, the strategic roadmap, remember that it defines the vision and strategy, not the execution of the roadmap. It rather guides the execution of that strategy. And it's really a vehicle for you to align internal stakeholders. And don't underestimate the value of being able to communicate effectively what your strategy is. And, the roadmap is, we see it as a living document. It's really a way of facilitating the discussion of different options and scenarios and then getting alignment with the stakeholders. And then it's a great vehicle for communicating the progress of development. And finally, if you have external stakeholders such as vendors or key partners or even customers, it's a great vehicle for that. We actually have several customers that are sharing a public roadmap. The government of UK, for example, is sharing their public roadmap with their constituents about what they're planning to develop. All right, so my first tip for you is to prioritize strategically. And what I mean by that is to have a model, either an actual model that you use in a spreadsheet or a product like ProductPlan to prioritize, or a mental model that you communicate to your stakeholders. And then in this example here, one way is through this value versus effort matrix. So you can put items onto this matrix, and the items with the higher value belong at the top, and the items with the higher effort go to the right. And the items that you want to focus on, the low-hanging fruit, are the items that have high value and low effort. Okay, so that's kind of a no-brainer. But then the real trick in product management is deciding which of those items that are high effort and high value do you prioritize? Because you should be peppering some of those difficult items into your roadmap, especially if they're competitive differentiators or a way of moving the needle for the organization. Now, there are some items on this matrix that you will never touch, right? These are the items that have low value and high effort. So with limited resources, and we all are constrained, you want to be picking the items that are high value and low effort first. Okay, my second tip for you is to align your roadmap with your product goals. And I mentioned at the beginning that the goals are derived from the vision that you have for the product. And these are some examples here of goals you might have. Now, every one of these goals should be backed up by specific KPIs or metrics so you understand whether you're being successful in delivering on these goals. So some of the goals might be competitive differentiation, customer delight, increasing customer lifetime value, and so on. It really depends on the goals that you have, depend on the kind of product that you have. It depends on the life cycle where your product is. It depends on the size of your company, and so on. So these are just some examples for you to maybe get inspired by. The third tip that I have for you is to form the decisions around your roadmap with metrics. And so, as I mentioned, you want to be able to tie metrics together with the goals that you've set out because you want to know if you're being successful. And make sure that you're picking a handful of metrics that are really important to the organization. And these, in turn, should help form what gets onto the roadmap and then go into the backlog. So, in our world, in this web-based software world, some of the metrics that we use are customer success metrics and product engagement metrics. So we want to know, are people using the product and are they happier with the product? So you might have product usage statistics such as daily active users, right? A better indicator of whether you're on the right track is by using quality scores. For example, Net Promoter Score is something that we use at ProductPlan to understand if we're moving in the right direction towards achieving our goals. Now, on the right side here, we see some business-oriented metrics. So these are internally focused, not really customer-focused, but my belief is that if you do focus on some of those customer delight and customer engagement metrics, that the business-oriented metrics will follow. So these include metrics such as increasing your customer lifetime value, increasing monthly recurring revenue or annual recurring revenue per customer. And so, the customer success and delight metrics do lend themselves to having a successful web-based business in our world. Okay, so tip number 4 that I have for you is to start every sprint with the roadmap. So most sprint planning meetings, let's say you do them every 2 weeks or so, you're going through the backlog, right? You've already gone through the grooming. You have your sprint in fairly good shape, and you're going through each one of these stories, and maybe you're getting final estimations and so on, and you're having discussions. But I feel that sometimes you miss the forest for the trees if you're focusing only on those details, only on the execution. And so I recommend that you level set with the team before sprint planning, and you start every sprint with the roadmap. And that way people have context. And at ProductPlan, every single sprint begins with our engineers and the development team understanding where we're heading. We also do quarterly and semi-annual planning meetings with everyone to give them the big picture about what we're planning on implementing and why. And I think the why is really important. And the backlog doesn't always indicate the why, or if it does indicate the why, it sometimes is obscured. And so that's why the roadmap is a great way of bringing it up a level. And this picture here is actually one of our customers who's using a touchscreen with ProductPlan on it. And so I think that visual high-level view of where you're headed is really important. All right, so tip number 5. I recommend that you group the roadmap together and even the stories in the backlog by a theme. And so themes can be developed in a number of different ways, but I like to think about themes as being customer value-driven ways of organizing what you're delivering. So for a lot of us, the roadmap or even the backlog is a bunch of features, right? It's a bunch of tasks and issues and stories and features. And I encourage you to bring that up a level and to group things together into a theme. Now, in this example here, the theme is, if I have an e-commerce platform, my customers complete their first purchase faster, right? So this has a customer value related to it. And within that theme, you have all the things that you have to develop in order to accomplish that goal of customers completing their first purchase faster. So you want to make it more mobile friendly. You want to change out your credit card processor. You want to do some UX improvements to that shopping cart. And so when you're doing this, you're accomplishing several things. One is that you're giving the engineering team context. you're also making it easier to kind of group those stories together and determine what the minimum viable product is, releasable product is within your backlog. And they're also delivering to customers some chunks of value. And I think that's an important thing. Rather than delivering features piecemeal, which certainly do have value, you're organizing it in a way that you can engage with customers and you can deliver to them something that's really valuable. All right. So I also have a bonus suggestion for you, and that's to present your roadmap visually. So don't underestimate the value of having a visual roadmap. Whether you use a product like ProductPlan, or you're using another product, or even PowerPoint, or even Excel, I think it's important to be able to bring it up to a high enough level, not have too much on this, color code it, relate it back to the goals that you've set out for the organization. And I think that you'll find that your communications with your stakeholders and with the development team are much better because of that. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to Andre.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
Awesome. We got lots and lots of questions. Please continue to use the panel, the question panel, and submit your questions. I know we set aside 15 minutes for questions, and the total length of the webinar was scheduled for 45 minutes. We went a little longer, but if everybody's okay staying a few minutes longer, that would be great, because we got so many questions. Thanks for submitting all of them. And keep them coming, as I said. We're going to look through the questions. So the first question is for Jim. Jim, the question is, how do I get the technical team more excited about the roadmap and able to see the strategic intent, the bigger picture? Any recommendations?
Yeah, definitely. Something that I've done in the past is not only presenting the visual roadmap that indicates the why behind what you're doing, how it relates back to the goals, but also making it very realistic. And by that, I mean bringing customer evidence to the table. So I've been in product management for a lot of years now, and have conducted thousands of interviews with customers and potential customers. And with every one of those, I'm taking notes. And often I'm recording those conversations as well, whether it's audio recording or GoToMeeting, as we review prototypes and have a discussion around that. And so if I can actually have somebody from the development team, and even an engineering, somebody from the engineering team, in on those meetings, I find that they bring the message back to the team with enthusiasm, and also they bring back examples and quotes. And I think that's important. Now, if you don't have people from the development team in these meetings, you can bring those to the table yourself. And so I think anytime you can bring a customer quote, an audio clip, a real example about how implementing a specific feature is going to improve that customer's life in some way, you're going to get so much more enthusiasm on the team. And I think you'll see that they'll actually, because they understand and they have context around why you're doing this in the first place and the impact it's going to have, they're going to be able to come up with creative solutions that you hadn't thought about for your roadmap. And so I encourage you to bring customer evidence to the table. And if it's not specific customer evidence, bring together metrics, talk about how much time it's going to save, and so on. So there's a couple of suggestions for you there.
Thanks, Jim. Mike, I think the next one is a good one for you. The question is, how should we handle multiple backlogs for multiple products? Any recommendations?
Yeah, well, one, obviously, if you got multiple backlogs, you obviously want to manage those in one tool, right, inside of Jira. But I don't know. I mean, Jim, maybe you want to chime in on this one. I don't think I have a perfect answer right now.
Yeah. So multiple backlogs are really common, and often we'll find a product manager who's responsible for a couple of development teams with different backlogs. I think it's really important that those backlogs remain separate, because the goals that you have for the team and the metrics that they're being, evaluated by will probably be very different. The roadmap can be the same document, and we often see that. In ProductPlan, we have a feature called the master plan So it's like a portfolio view of what's happening in the organization. So you might have separate roadmaps tied to individual backlogs. And then with the master plan feature, you can aggregate those together. And it's for that single view. So even though they might connect out to different backlogs, you can have that. But definitely separate backlogs are a real challenge for product managers that are managing multiple products or teams.
Thanks, Jim. Here's another backlog one. Let's see what you think about this one, Mike. I'm interested in the idea of customers voting on items in the backlog. Do you recommend that? What tools are available to allow for that?
Yeah, so actually we do, and we use Jira for that. And I think if you went to jira.atlassian.com, you would see what we think is a great example, and how we use Jira and how those upvotes are very important. And then also too, it allows people to follow, those open issues as well, and they can comment and provide feedback. So it's more than just voting. They're allowed to comment and help us shape what we do, and then we leverage that as well to reach out to customers and ask them direct questions as well when we decide to work on that particular feature, and bring it into the backlog or the roadmap. So that's a great question, and we definitely encourage that.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Here's another one for you, Jim. How do you tie KPIs with the roadmap versus backlog? For example, productivity of the engineering team by epics. Any thoughts on this question?
Yeah. So when I'm talking about KPIs, I'm usually speaking about customer-oriented or business-oriented KPIs. And certainly there are great ways of evaluating the velocity and the performance of an engineering team, and they're very internally focused. And so I know that Jira has ways of evaluating velocity and reviewing team performance, and especially if you're using story points. So it sounds to me that this question is really talking about evaluating the performance of the dev team. And although story points are really inaccurate, I've found, estimation is really tricky, and there is no estimate that's accurate. I do find that using story points and doing techniques such as planning poker during sprint planning, those are really an effective way of kind of getting the understanding where you stand as far as velocity. But it takes, once you implement that process, it takes a long time to really understand where the team is headed, and velocity. But again, because it's an inexact science, don't read too much into cumulative points and velocity. So I really think that teams, even though it's difficult to do, should really be evaluated based on how much value they're delivering to the customer, right? Rather than an internally focused metric such as velocity.
Awesome. Thank you, Jim. Here's another backlog one for you, Mike. So the question is, in what circumstances is the philosophy of if a backlog item is more than whatever the time frame is, it's no longer relevant or helpful?
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think that's one thing where sometimes people fall into the trap that they just want to keep everything open in their backlog and have everything there all the time because, oh my gosh, we don't want to lose it, right? And one thing that's important to remember, with Jira is you can close those items. They go to your parking lot. They're out of that main view, so you're not worrying about them right now. So effectively, they're closed. But the good thing is they're not lost, right? I mean, you still have them, and it's definitely a great thing to maybe go back and review those things that you've just decided or rejected or chose to not do, and maybe in future times, maybe technology has evolved and those old backlog items, and maybe it was just not feasible or cost effective then, maybe in the future it will be. So you don't want to lose all that feedback, right? I mean, that's probably valuable feedback that was driven by a customer, so you don't want to just nuke it and make it go away, but obviously you don't want it in your frontline view and being a distraction to your company and your developers if you can't act on it right now. So that's really exactly why grooming the backlog and using Jira that way is so important.
Thanks, Mike. Next one is a good one for you, Jim. The question is, how do you use the roadmap to inform decisions about what to focus on in the backlog?
Oh, interesting. Okay. So there is not. So as we've talked about, you can connect the roadmap to the backlog, but there's not often this one-to-one connection between the two, because I might have a big initiative that I'm developing, and maybe that big initiative takes several sprints, and I don't exactly know what my performance is going to be. I don't exactly know before the sprint starts how much I'm going to be able to develop. Now, especially if I'm using Kanban, right? So I'm just moving from one stage to another, right? I may have these items prioritized on my list, but I don't exactly know in 2 or 3 sprints how far I'm going to get. And so, so that's why I like to think about themes. So, for example, that shopping cart completion theme that I talked about. When product managers and the engineering team think in terms of themes, it gives them a whole lot of flexibility. So I may know the 5 or 6 features that I really have to have, but I don't really know yet how detailed I'm going to get with those features. I don't know how I may have a beautiful prototype, right? But there are maybe some things that I'm going to decide because they're hard, I may not do, or I may do much later. And so themes make it possible to kind of move things in and out of the backlog, yet retain the theme. Keep the team focused on what it is that they're accomplishing. But when you use themes, you can it gives the product manager some flexibility to move things in or out, shift things out a little bit further, and so on. So I do believe that it's you want to organize it by those models like a theme, rather than being really specific in your roadmap.
Thanks, Jim. Mike, this one I think is a good one for you, and maybe Jim, you can comment on this as well. I would love to hear both of your opinions on this one. The question is, how do you balance the backlog between feature development and the ad hoc work that might come in, such as bugs? I often end up with one backlog that's separated between feature development and then like a mini backlog of prioritized bugs. Mike, do you want to maybe answer first?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I think it's one of those things that can depend. And I'm even thinking about some folks internally where this discussion has come up, and 2 people within Atlassian, in the way they manage their teams, they even had different approaches and different answers to this. So one, I think it might depend on how buggy your products are, and how many bugs you're dealing with, right? If that really warrants that separate workflow. In a past life at a startup, we decided to kind of even divide our team a little bit, to where we had a team that was more focused on bugs and real-time responses for our cloud platform and just addressing those. And then we had some other teams that were more focused on longer-term feature development. And we found that helped just manage that balance, to where the team wasn't working on a new feature and then getting pulled off to a bug. We had core engineers that could address those bugs. And we did that at a time, frankly, when we were a little bit more bug challenged. And that was kind of at the beginning of our move to Jira, when we were still working through a lot of past issues, if you will. So I've seen both employed and both employed effectively. Jim?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I completely agree with you that it depends. It depends on the life cycle of where your product is. I have always mixed in the bugs within that particular backlog. I do feel like that, even though this 0 bug, agile ideal is out there, it's, of course, impossible. But I do feel like ownership is really important, and I think that the team working on features needs to be also working on the bugs. So in my experience, it's always been intermingled. I wouldn't say that I've ever actually worked in an environment where we had that 0 bug approach, where every bug is squashed. It's always an evaluation and prioritization question. There will be some bugs that maybe are moved down further, and so that's my experience, at least.
Thanks to both of you. I know we reached the top of the 45 minutes, but we got so many questions. So thank you for staying on. Maybe we do 2 more questions and then we're going to do a wrap. Mike, the next question for you, the question is, if a customer gets antsy, how do you prevent constant intervention from expanding the size of a project's backlog?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where you have to just say no, and you have to have your product North Star and your product vision, right? And I think that's again where this marriage between Jira and product plan can come into play as well, right? Where customers sometimes can just start to demand things that are just not in your path, and that's where you can look at things in your backlog and just start to realize that, you know what, these things are taking us in a direction that take us away from what we have outlined in our product roadmap, and you've got to be able to say no, right? As open as we are with customers and as much feedback as we like to bring in, and it comes all the way down from our founders. There are times where we know what we want to do, we know who we are as a company, and we have our vision, and that doesn't always perfectly align to every customer that uses Jira, and that's just a fact.
Thanks, Mike. Jim, this question is for you. How often do you review your roadmap? How often do you revisit and update the product roadmap?
Good question. So you meaning the product manager, if the product manager is responsible for it, that roadmap should be reviewed at least weekly. Again, it depends on the organization. There are some organizations that are larger organizations where decisions need to be made further out, where expectations are set that you need to convey what you'll be building, 2 or 3 quarters out. But by and large, the product manager should be reevaluating, reprioritizing that roadmap regularly. Now, if you means the engineering team or other stakeholders, I typically have seen people doing roadmap review meetings monthly with those teams. So I do think it's really important to make sure that all stakeholders are getting regular updates with what's happening on the roadmap. If not really far out, then the shorter term initiatives that you'll be delivering. In Product Plan, it's really easy to for specific audiences to kind of narrow the scope of what you show them on the roadmap. And so with some teams, for example, sales, you want to keep sales in the loop with what's happening, but you don't want to be promising specific dates, right? So you might even take the dates off the roadmap and maybe show them what's coming out in the next, maybe 2 or 3 months, that sort of thing. But I do think that regularly reviewing the roadmap with the stakeholders is really important to get everybody on the same page, to get buy-in so that people aren't second guessing what you're doing, as well as getting their insights, getting their important feedback into what they'd like to see developed.
Awesome. Thanks to both of you for answering so many questions, and thanks for everybody for staying longer and answering or submitting so many questions. It was a very active session. I appreciate that. And I want to leave you with this, now that you hopefully got some recommendations on how to effectively manage not only your backlog, but also your roadmap. I would encourage you to go to the Atlassian marketplace and search for Product Plan and check it out for yourself. We have a 30-day free trial, and our trial is fully functional, and you can check out the Product Plan Jira integration yourself and see that for yourself. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar, and thanks for such an active webinar session. Goodbye.